A brilliant surgeon is abandoned while pregnant, left with nothing but a broken heart and a fragile future. 3 years later, she returns, not for revenge, but with a genius son and a legacy that stuns the world. This is a story of betrayal, resilience, and a quiet rise to greatness that no one saw coming. Where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a story that stirs your soul. The kitchen was still dark when Emily Dawson stepped inside, her hospital badge still clipped to her scrub top and the scent of antiseptic clinging to her skin. The morning sunlight hadn't yet broken through the clouds hovering over the city skyline, but inside her, something brilliant had already dawned. In her trembling hand, she held the test, the tiny white stick that confirmed everything she dared to hope for. 2 pink lines, undeniable and bold. Positive. Her heart, however, wasn't racing with panic. It beat steady, solid, calm. She'd spent years saving other people's children. Now she would have her own. She placed the test on the counter and exhaled, eyes flicking toward the hallway. The apartment was silent. Too silent for the excitement dancing inside her. Richard Langley was probably still in his study, buried in quarterly reports and global projections, always projecting forward, always thinking 5 moves ahead. But for once, Emily had news that wasn't part of a chart or forecast. It was real. Raw. Life. "Richard," she called softly, moving toward the study. He was there, tie loosened, shirt sleeves rolled up, back hunched over a stack of documents on the sleek black desk. His eyes flicked up, the flicker of recognition on his face quickly smoothed into a blank stare. He didn't rise, didn't smile, didn't speak. "I came straight from my shift," Emily said, heart thudding now. "I couldn't wait to tell you." She held up the test like a peace offering, like something sacred. "I'm pregnant. We're having a baby." For a moment, the only sound was the quiet hum of the city traffic below and the distant whir of the HVAC system. Then Richard exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. His jaw tightened, his hands folded in front of him with calculated precision. "We need to talk." Emily's throat tightened. She had heard those words from patients' families before, from surgeons in break rooms. Never from the man she had spent the last 3 years planning a future with. "There's been a shift," he continued, his voice unnervingly flat. "Langley International is finalizing the merger with Wu Holdings. I'm moving to Singapore next month." Her breath caught. "Okay," she said slowly. "Then we'll go together. I can transfer to another hospital. It'll take some time, but..." He finally looked her in the eye. The moment their eyes met, she knew. Knew something had already broken between them, quietly, cleanly, like the snap of a scalpel blade. "I'm getting married," Richard said. She blinked. The words didn't compute. "What?" "To Vanessa Wu," he added, almost as an afterthought. "It's strategic. Her father's company owns 22% of the controlling stake. The board pushed for it. It's business." Emily's laugh came out broken, bitter. "You're walking away from me, from your child, for a deal?" "I've made arrangements," he said. Standing and gathering his things like this was just another board meeting coming to an end. "You'll keep the apartment. You'll be provided for. You won't need anything." "Don't reduce this to assets," she snapped, her voice cracking. "Look at me, Richard. Look at me and tell me the last 3 years meant nothing." He hesitated. His eyes met hers again. But what she saw wasn't guilt, wasn't love. It was absence. A ghost where a man used to be. "I'm sorry," he said, and it sounded rehearsed. A line prepared in advance, filed neatly in the same drawer as quarterly earnings and legal disclaimers. Then he walked out. No slammed doors. No angry arguments. Just a quiet exit, deliberate and clean. Emily stood there, rooted to the floor, staring at the doorway long after he vanished. Her fingers still clutched the test. It beeped once, just a soft sound from the digital screen, but it was enough to shatter whatever composure she had left. Her phone buzzed on the counter. A message from Sandra. "How did it go? Is he excited?" Another news alert. Langley Wu merger finalized. CEO Richard Langley to wed heiress Vanessa Wu in Singapore. Her knees buckled. The floor seemed to fall away from beneath her. She barely made it to the bathroom before the nausea overtook her. But it wasn't morning sickness. It was heartbreak. She curled on the cold tile, arms instinctively wrapping around her stomach, as if shielding the fragile flutter of life inside her. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. Her pager beeped. Emergency call. Pediatric cardiac case. A life needed saving. Emily rose, wiped her face, grabbed her keys. At the elevator, she hesitated, then slipped the pregnancy test into her pocket. Not as a keepsake, but as proof. Of the child. Of the betrayal. Of what she was now. A mother with no partner, but a spine forged in steel. She drove to the hospital as if on autopilot, the city passing in streaks of gray and orange. She leaned her head against the cold ATM machine in the hospital lobby, trying her card again. Access denied. Again. Denied. He had wiped everything. Savings. Checking. Even her personal account. Behind her, a voice cut through the fog. "You look like something the ER dragged in." It was Sandra, holding out a coffee. Eyeliner perfect, lips set in concern. Emily took it with numb fingers. "He wiped it all," she whispered. "Even my name off the lease." Sandra's eyes narrowed. "That's illegal. He can't touch your personal account." "He did. His name is on everything. I thought we were building a life, not a legal trap." "Then we build something new," Sandra said, already pulling out her phone. "New bank, new lawyer, new future." Emily tried to protest, but Sandra stopped her cold. "You don't have to thank me. Just promise me this. When you're back on your feet, we make him regret ever hearing your name." A voice called over the intercom. "Pediatric team, stat, another emergency." Emily looked up, took a breath. "Deal," she said, already moving toward the OR. There was a child waiting, a heart to fix, a future to claim, hers and Jacob's. The sun had risen, finally, bathing the hospital in a warm, pale glow. But inside Emily Dawson, something brighter was already burning. Purpose. The fluorescent lights of the pediatric surgical wing buzzed softly overhead as Emily scrubbed in for her fourth case of the night. Her back ached, her legs throbbed, and deep inside her belly, the gentle, rhythmic flutter reminded her she wasn't alone anymore. But even as her body began to protest the weight of pregnancy, her hands remained precise, her focus razor-sharp. There was no room for distraction in the operating room. Not when a child's heart was on the table. Sandra had been relentless in the background, setting things in motion. Within a week, Emily had a new bank account, a new phone plan, and a sharp-tongued lawyer named Carlos, who knew how to turn quiet rage into courtroom fire. Emily barely had time to notice any of it. She lived in back-to-back shifts, trading sleep for lives saved and heartbreak for heartbeats. It was during one of those long nights, with blood on her gloves and adrenaline still coursing through her system, that it happened. A 6-year-old boy with a congenital valve defect was rushed into surgery just after 1 a.m. The OR was tense, the parents sobbing in the hallway. Emily moved like she always did. Focused, composed, hands steady, even as her belly tightened with the whisper of a contraction. No one questioned her. No one dared. But as the boy's tiny heart resumed a healthy rhythm beneath the lights, a sharp pain seized her, deeper than the one she'd been ignoring. She didn't flinch. "Close him up," she told her resident calmly. "Now." Naomi, standing across the table, didn't miss a thing. "Emily?" she asked, her voice hushed. "Are you?" "Yeah," Emily said, her voice tight. "I think I'm in labor." Chaos followed. A gurney appeared as if summoned by magic. Her scrubs were peeled away, replaced by a soft gown. Between the contractions and the beeping of monitors, Emily only had one question. "The child? My patient. He's stable," Naomi said, gripping her hand. "Now please let someone take care of you for once." 14 hours later, in a delivery room lit by gentle lamps and filled with the hum of machines, a cry cut through the air. Strong, fierce, and full of life. Emily, slick with sweat and tears, cradled her newborn son in her trembling arms. He had dark hair and wide, steady eyes. He was perfect. "He looks like him," she whispered, voice cracking. "No," Sandra said gently, brushing a damp curl from Emily's forehead. "He looks like you. Strong, stubborn, already rewriting the rules, just like his mom." A nurse entered the room, arms full of white lilies and a small card. "These came for you, Dr. Dawson." Emily blinked. The handwriting on the card was familiar. "Congratulations, Eleanor Langley." "She sent these?" Emily asked quietly. "Hospital gossip," Sandra replied. "Probably heard through someone in admin. Want me to toss them?" Emily looked from the bouquet to her son, then shook her head. "No, leave them by the window. She may be a stranger now, but she's still his grandmother." In the days that followed, Emily recovered in the maternity ward, but she wasn't idle. Between feedings and baby checkups, she answered legal forms, skimmed over NDAs masked as financial gestures, and met quietly with Carlos, who was already digging into Richard's offshore holdings and executive severance package. Everything Richard had done had been cold, calculated, and utterly traceable. When she returned home to Sandra's apartment, Jacob, she had chosen the name during a night shift weeks earlier, settled easily into the spare bedroom, once home to Sandra's sister. Boxes lined the walls. Legal folders spilled across the kitchen table. A whiteboard in the hallway mapped out everything from feeding schedules to corporate connections. But amid the chaos, something steady bloomed. Peace. At night, when the world was quiet, Emily would press her cheek to Jacob's head and whisper stories of heart valves and miracles. He would curl close, warm and soft and safe, and the storm outside never touched them. 2 months later, the hospital's board announced full funding for Emily's research proposal, a new technique for pediatric valve repair that reduced recovery time by 40%. It was groundbreaking, and it was hers. "You're leading the team," Sandra had said, sliding the acceptance letter across the coffee table. "You're not just saving hearts anymore, you're rewriting the way we fix them." Emily didn't smile, not quite, but her chest lifted with something different, something earned. She looked at Jacob asleep in his bassinet, his tiny fingers curled into fists, and felt the truth settle in her bones. She didn't need Richard's name or his fortune. She was building something far more powerful, a legacy. 3 months in, Emily received another call from Eleanor. The older woman's voice cracked, quiet but firm. "Please, let me meet him. Just once." Emily hesitated, but something in Eleanor's tone sounded less like obligation and more like regret. She agreed, on one condition. It would be in the hospital garden under a nurse's supervision. Eleanor arrived in a soft gray coat, her once regal posture slightly stooped. She approached the bench where Emily sat, holding Jacob with tentative steps. "He's beautiful," she said. "He's loved," Emily replied. The silence stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. "I tried," Eleanor murmured, "to stop Richard, but he was determined, arrogant, just like his father." "I know," Emily said, "but thank you for the flowers and the shares." Eleanor nodded. "He may have his father's mind, but I pray he has your heart." When she left, Emily watched her disappear into the hallway, shoulders hunched. She didn't know what to make of Eleanor's affection, if it was guilt or grace, but she knew it came from a place deeper than family name. By the time Jacob turned 1, Emily had published 2 papers, won an innovation grant, and led a dozen successful surgeries using her new valve method. Jacob's first word wasn't mama, it was heart. Sandra swore she didn't coach him. And Richard? His wedding had taken place in Singapore under an orchid-draped archway. Glossy photos appeared in business magazines, showing smiles so polished they looked painted on. But Emily had stopped checking after the 3rd headline. She didn't need to know what his life looked like. She already knew what it lacked. It lacked Jacob. And Jacob lacked for nothing. Late one night, as Emily sat in her office reviewing surgical notes with Jacob sleeping nearby in a bassinet, she caught her reflection in the window. She didn't look tired anymore. She looked steady. The woman who had been abandoned in a penthouse had rebuilt herself in an on-call room. Her phone buzzed. A message from Carlos. More documents from Richard's team. Another attempt at settling. Emily looked down at her son and smiled. "They still don't get it," she whispered. This wasn't about revenge. This was about Jacob, and the empire she was building, quietly, purposefully, would never be made of glass. It would be made of heart. Jacob Dawson had just turned 2 when Emily began noticing the subtle signs, ones that most parents might chalk up to coincidence, but she saw them for what they truly were. Brilliance. He solved puzzles meant for 5-year-olds in minutes. He lined up his toy syringes and heart models from her home office in anatomically correct order. And one night, as she reviewed a cardiac case file at the kitchen table, Jacob climbed onto her lap, pointed at a diagram of a malformed aortic valve, and whispered, "Broken." Emily froze, her eyes flicking between the file and her son's wide brown eyes. "Yes," she whispered. "That one's broken." "Fix it," Jacob said simply, as if it were obvious. Then he slid off her lap and wandered toward his growing stack of medical books for toddlers. Emily leaned back in her chair, heart thudding. She wasn't just raising a survivor, she was raising a storm. By then, her work had begun drawing serious attention. Her non-invasive valve replacement technique, once dismissed by skeptical colleagues, was not only being implemented across multiple hospitals, but had also reduced post-op recovery times by nearly half. International journals called it a quiet revolution in pediatric cardiology. Emily called it redemption. Every article, every breakthrough, felt like another brick in the fortress she was building around her son's future. Sandra, always 2 steps ahead, began exploring long-term options, investments, trust structures, legal protections. She looped in Carlos, who'd turned his quiet courtroom rage into a strategic edge sharper than a scalpel. Emily didn't ask how or when, but a few months later, she learned that Eleanor Langley had discreetly transferred a chunk of Whitestone Global shares, Richard's company, into a trust under Jacob's name. She did what? Emily asked, holding the legal folder with disbelief. Sandra grinned. It's real, ironclad. She did it weeks before her latest treatment started, told Carlos directly she was correcting a generational error. Emily stared at the documents, the numbers staggering, the implications even more so. With Eleanor's shares and Emily's own quiet investments, Jacob now held a significant piece of the very empire Richard had tried to keep from them. She's making a move, Carlos said bluntly. My guess? Eleanor's trying to protect Jacob before Richard burns it all down. But it wasn't just about money anymore. It was about voice, influence, power. Then came the call from Vanessa Wu. Emily hadn't heard her voice since the week Richard walked out, but there was no mistaking the carefully measured tone that came through the receiver now. We need to meet. Emily stood in the center of the hospital's rooftop garden, phone pressed to her ear, Jacob playing with Sandra a few feet away. Why? Because Richard is unraveling, Vanessa said plainly. He's made enemies. The board is watching, and your name is back in circulation. Emily said nothing. Let the silence stretch. I'm not asking for friendship, Vanessa continued. This is business. There's a shift coming. I think you and we might be on the same side. Emily looked out over the city skyline. Years ago, that skyline had watched her lose everything. Now, it stood beneath her. I'll consider it, she said, but only if it benefits Jacob. Of course, Vanessa replied smoothly. He's the future, isn't he? Emily ended the call. She didn't trust Vanessa, but she believed in reading the tides. And right now, the current was pulling in her direction. A week later, she received an invitation. The Henderson Foundation Charity Gala. A black-tie affair, high profile, filled with the elite of both medical and corporate worlds. And headlining the evening, an award for innovations in pediatric medicine presented to Dr. Emily Dawson. Richard Langley would be in attendance. So would the cameras. She didn't hesitate. When the night arrived, Seattle's skyline glittered in the distance as she stood in front of her bedroom mirror, adjusting the deep emerald silk of her gown. Her hair was swept back in soft waves, her posture proud. Jacob, now nearly 3, stood at her side in a miniature tuxedo, solemn as a page boy. You ready, little man? She asked, kneeling. Jacob nodded with the seriousness of a surgeon. Ready, Dr. Mommy. Sandra appeared in the doorway in a sapphire blue gown, radiant. They're waiting for you backstage. Emily looked down at her son and then at the reflection of herself. The woman who had once cried on cold bathroom tiles now stood tall, with her legacy holding her hand. I'm not leaving him behind, she said simply. Then we go together. Sandra replied. The ballroom shimmered under golden chandeliers. Murmurs rippled as Emily and Jacob walked in, hand in hand. Photographers snapped wildly. Whispers followed her like perfume. Elegant, brilliant, unstoppable. And then she saw him. Richard stood across the room, older, thinner, still polished but visibly weary. His eyes locked onto hers. For a breath, the world stilled. Then the event organizer appeared. Dr. Dawson, you're on in 5. Emily knelt before Jacob. Remember what we practiced? He nodded. I give you the shiny doctor prize and say congratulations. Perfect, she whispered. The lights dimmed. The crowd quieted. Her name echoed across the room. Dr. Emily Dawson. She stepped onto the stage with Jacob beside her. As applause swelled, her heels clicked like drum beats of resolve. She took the mic. 3 years ago, she began, her voice clear and sure. I learned something extraordinary about hearts, especially the tiny ones. They're not fragile, they're fierce. They bend. They break. But they also rebuild, stronger, smarter, more resilient than before. She paused, looking down at Jacob. He stepped forward, holding the crystal award high in his tiny hands. Congratulations, Dr. Mommy, he said into the microphone, voice proud and clear. The room erupted. Laughter, tears, a standing ovation. Emily didn't look toward Richard. She didn't need to. Her success wasn't in reclaiming anything he once denied her. It was in creating something he would never understand, never own. As they exited the stage, Sandra leaned close. "He's gone." Emily gave a soft nod. "He left right after the speech." "Good," she said. Later that night, as Jacob slept curled up against her in the limo, Emily glanced at the envelope in her hand. Another offer, another NDA, this time from Vanessa, but all she could think about was the heartbeat tucked beside her. Small, steady, strong. Let them plot. Let them beg. Let them scheme. She already held the future. And his name was Jacob. The gala had ended hours ago, but the buzz still lingered in the air like expensive perfume. Emily sat cross-legged on the plush carpet of Sandra's apartment, her gown unzipped halfway, her heels abandoned by the door, while Jacob lay curled beside her in his tuxedo, clutching the crystal award he'd presented just hours earlier. His breathing was steady, the way only a child who had danced, posed, and grinned through 1,000 camera flashes could sleep. She brushed a lock of hair off his forehead and smiled, not because the world had finally seen her, but because he had. Sandra walked in, still radiant in her sapphire gown, a tablet in her hand. "He looked gutted," she said, not needing to clarify who. Didn't say a word, just left. Emily didn't reply. Her fingers moved absently through Jacob's curls. "I know what you're thinking," Sandra added, sitting across from her. "But don't give him even a corner of your thoughts tonight." Emily sighed. "I'm not. I saw something in his face." "Regret?" Sandra offered. "No," Emily said. "Loss." The following morning, the press had exploded. Articles splashed with headlines like "Prodigy Presents Award to Single Mom Surgeon," and "The Real Legacy of Langley, a Child Genius," went viral within hours. What few people outside the medical world knew was that Emily had just accepted an invitation to present her groundbreaking procedure at the International Pediatric Cardiology Conference in Baltimore the following month. She almost turned it down, until she read the speaker list and saw the final keynote slot. Richard Langley. His company, still clinging to its reputation, had sponsored the event, and he would be receiving an Innovation in Medical Philanthropy award. Emily laughed for the first time in days. "Baltimore, huh?" Sandra said as she folded laundry. "Home of crab cakes, charm, and apparently poetic justice." Jacob looked up from his oversized coloring book filled with anatomy illustrations. "Is that the place with the big aquarium?" Emily knelt beside him. "That's right. Can we go see the jellyfish?" "We can see anything you want," he beamed, then returned to his drawing. A cartoon version of a heart valve, smiling next to a scalpel. A week before the conference, Emily received another call from Eleanor. Her voice sounded thinner, brittle around the edges. "I was hoping," she said carefully, "that I might see Jacob again." Emily's heart clenched. She hadn't heard from the woman since the gala. "Is everything okay?" There was a pause. "I've started treatment," Eleanor said. "Stage 4, pancreatic. It's aggressive." Emily leaned against the kitchen counter, trying to steady her breath. "How long?" "Months. Maybe less." The silence between them said what words couldn't. "He doesn't know," Emily murmured. "No, and I don't want him to, not yet. I just want to see him. Talk, before I can't." Emily agreed, quietly, without hesitation. But things escalated faster than expected. Days later, Eleanor was admitted to the oncology ward under Emily's hospital. Sandra found out first, through a flurry of test results and a quiet call from one of the nurses. "She's asking for you," Sandra told Emily, handing her a file. Emily looked through the lab values. Her training kicked in before her emotions could. Liver enzymes through the roof. Pain levels managed only by a cocktail of meds. The woman who once held court in boardrooms now lay quietly in a sterile white gown. When Emily entered the room, Eleanor looked up, her face pale but her eyes sharp. "You made headlines," she whispered. Emily pulled up a chair and checked the IV line. "So did you, apparently." Eleanor smiled faintly. "Celeste is preparing to leave him, you know. She's angling for board support. She thinks you're the key." Emily's hand stilled. She reached out again. I ignored her. "You shouldn't," Eleanor said, a flicker of urgency in her voice. "You hold more power than you realize. Your shares, Jacob's trust. You could tip the balance." Emily didn't reply. Her gaze drifted to the sleeping figure of Jacob outside the glass wall, coloring in the waiting room with Sandra. "But that's not why I called you here," Eleanor said, softer now. I want to see him, while I still can. Later that evening, after her final surgery of the day, Emily wheeled Jacob into the room. He looked around, a bit shy, then climbed into the chair beside Eleanor's bed. "Hi," he said softly. "Hello, sweetheart," Eleanor whispered, brushing his hand. "Do you remember me?" Jacob nodded. "You sent the books?" "Yes, I did." "Thank you. The one about heart valves was my favorite." Eleanor chuckled, then coughed. "You're going to be someone very special, Jacob." "I already am," he said proudly. "I'm going to help Mommy fix hearts." Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes, and Emily turned away, pretending to check the monitors. As they prepared to leave, Eleanor held Emily's hand for a moment longer. "Don't let him grow up thinking he was unwanted. He wasn't, not by me." "I know," Emily said. The next morning, Emily received a message from Celeste. Short, calculated. A proposal for joint leverage to force Richard off the board. Emily didn't reply right away. Instead, she met with Carlos and Sandra, the three of them poring over spreadsheets, board minutes, and timelines. It was all falling apart for Richard, slowly, publicly, irrevocably. And then came the headline: Richard Langley removed as CEO amid board shakeup. Emily sat at her desk with Jacob asleep in a blanket behind her. She didn't cry, she didn't celebrate. She just closed her laptop, stood, and walked over to the window. Below, the city hummed. In the reflection, she could see Jacob's small chest rising and falling. Her empire was built on no one's ruin but her own strength, and it stood tall. The call came late that night. Eleanor's vitals were crashing. Emily raced through the corridors, barely remembering how she got there. Inside the room, Jacob sat beside Eleanor's bed, clutching her hand. She wanted to see him, Sandra said quietly. She didn't want to go without that. Emily moved to the bedside, placing her hand over both of theirs. Eleanor's smile was faint, but it was real. As her monitors steadied temporarily, Eleanor looked at Emily. "When Celeste calls again," she whispered, "listen. Sometimes revenge and justice wear the same face." Emily nodded. "I'll bring him again tomorrow." And with that, she kissed her son's forehead, then Eleanor's fragile hand. The storm hadn't passed, but the sky was beginning to clear. And this time, Emily wasn't alone in facing it. She had her son, she had her strength, and soon, she would have the truth. The private jet touched down in Singapore just past midnight, its wheels hissing against the tarmac as the city's skyline glittered in the distance. Emily stared out the oval window, her reflection faint against the glass, Jacob's tiny head resting on her shoulder. He'd fallen asleep mid-sentence, a book about fluid dynamics still open in his lap, his breath steady, his hand loosely curled against her arm. Even now, on the brink of a battle that could reshape the future of Whitestone Global, his presence grounded her. Sandra met them at the arrival gate with her usual precision, ushering them into a waiting car. "The board meets in 36 hours. Celeste's side has 5 votes. Richard has 4. With your shares combined with Jacob's, you become the deciding factor." Emily didn't reply right away. She glanced at her son's sleeping form, then looked back out the window. "Has he tried to reach out?" Sandra hesitated. "Not directly, but he knows you're here. There were reporters at the hospital in Seattle. They're connecting dots." Emily sighed. "Let them." The next morning, she met with Celeste in the penthouse lounge of the Conrad Hotel. The room was cold, sleek, and sterile, just like Celeste's expression as she stood beside the floor-to-ceiling windows, arms crossed over her designer suit. "You're early," Celeste said. "I don't like surprises," Emily replied. Celeste turned, studying her. "You don't have to like me. You just have to see the opportunity. Richard's reign is done. You know it. The board knows it. He's lost focus, lost leverage, and with Eleanor gone—" "Don't," Emily cut in, voice sharp. "Don't use her like a pawn. She gave me those shares for Jacob. Not for you." Celeste didn't flinch. "I'm not the enemy, Emily. I'm a realist, and so are you. That company is your son's legacy, whether you like it or not. Help me clean up the mess Richard made and secure Jacob's future in the process." Emily leaned forward, resting her palms on the glass table between them. "He doesn't even know Jacob exists." Celeste raised an eyebrow. "Then maybe it's time he learned what he threw away." By the time the boardroom doors opened the next day, the air inside was heavy with tension. Every chair was filled, every face sharp. Emily stood at the far end of the long obsidian table, her presence electric in a tailored black suit, calm and composed. Jacob sat quietly in the waiting room down the hall with Sandra. flipping through a workbook of basic electrical circuits, waiting for his mother's signal. Richard sat across from her, pale, visibly aged. His confidence was cracked, his smile unsure, his voice muted. He hadn't spoken to her yet, hadn't dared. Celeste opened the meeting with poise and practiced charm, laying out her proposal for restructuring, cutting deadweight projects, refocusing innovation funds, rebuilding the brand. Then Emily stood. "Before I vote," she said, "I want to share something." She connected her laptop to the central screen. A video began to play. Jacob, seated at his small desk, solving advanced physics equations while chatting softly with Eleanor, who laughed and encouraged him off camera. The board members watched in stunned silence. "This is Jacob Dawson," Emily said, her voice steady. "He's 3 years old, IQ tested at 164, and he's my son." The pause that followed was heavy, until she added, "Richard Langley's son." The air sucked out of the room. Across the table, Richard's face drained of color. His mouth parted slightly, but no words came. "My shares," Emily continued, "along with Jacob's, total 18%. Today, I'm voting in favor of Celeste Wu's proposal to remove Richard Langley as CEO of Whitestone Global." Gasps erupted. Legal counsel stood. Voices clashed. Richard finally rose from his chair. "You don't get to do this," he hissed, his voice low, dangerous. Emily turned to him, her voice calm but laced with steel. "You walked away from us, from him. Now you walk away from this company. That's the deal." She closed her laptop. Meeting adjourned. Before Richard could react, Sandra burst into the room, her expression urgent. "Emily, it's Eleanor. She's crashing." Emily didn't hesitate. She walked straight out of the boardroom, her heels echoing like a gavel. Richard followed 2 steps behind her, stunned and silent. They arrived at the hospital minutes later. Eleanor's condition had rapidly deteriorated. The monitors beeped erratically. Her breaths were shallow. Jacob sat beside her, holding her hand, his eyes wide and full of questions. "She wanted to see him again," the nurse whispered. "She said she wouldn't go until she did." Emily walked to the bedside, gently taking Eleanor's other hand. Her skin was ice. "She stabilized," the nurse said, surprised. "Barely, but holding." Eleanor's eyes fluttered open, and when she saw Emily and Jacob, she smiled faintly. "Did it work?" she whispered. Emily nodded. "He's out, Celeste is in." Eleanor looked at Jacob. "Smart boy, he'll fix this world." Then her gaze shifted to Richard, standing just beyond the curtain, ghost-like. "You see now," she said weakly. "You gave away more than you ever built." He didn't respond. Couldn't. Later that night, back in her hotel room, Emily received a delivery, a thick envelope from Eleanor's attorneys. Inside, a handwritten letter and a USB drive. The letter was simple. "For Jacob, when the time is right. And for you, Emily, because the world may never say it, but I will. You are the legacy worth building." The drive contained everything. Documentation of the merger's illegal origins, backdated licenses, forged contracts, proof that Richard had orchestrated his entire rise on deception long before he ever knew about Jacob. The next morning, Emily made the final call. Celeste's legal team prepared the full restructuring package, and Emily signed off, finalizing the transfer of authority. Then she blocked Richard's number, one last time. He called anyway. It went to voicemail. "You think you've won?" his voice said. "But I still deserve." She deleted the message before it finished. That night, as Jacob slept beside her, his tiny body curled against a pillow, Emily stared at the ceiling, the city lights painting gold shadows across the walls. The storm was quiet now, not gone, but passing. And when she finally slept, it was the deep, healing sleep of a woman who had stopped running, not because she was tired, but because she had arrived. In the morning, Jacob sat up with a yawn, blinking the sleep from his eyes. "Did we do it, Mommy?" Emily smiled, pulling him into her lap. "We did. And now what?" She kissed the top of his head. "Now, sweetheart, we build something better." And together, they would. The days that followed moved like a dream, one stitched together by exhaustion, legacy, and something Emily hadn't felt in years. Peace. Eleanor passed away just 1 hour before Emily's return to Seattle, her vitals quietly slipping away in the early hours of a rain-soaked morning. The hospital staff had tried to reach Emily mid-flight, but by the time her feet hit the ground, Sandra was waiting at the arrival gate, eyes glassy, holding a sealed envelope and a USB drive that Eleanor had left behind. "She wanted you to have this," Sandra said softly, placing the items in Emily's hand. "Said it was for Jacob." and for protection. Emily didn't open them at first. She tucked them into her coat pocket, numb with jet lag and grief, and drove straight to the hospital, where Jacob had been spending the weekend with Sandra's sister. When he saw her, he ran into her arms without hesitation, his little body warm, his voice muffled against her shoulder. "Did she say goodbye?" Emily held him tighter. "She did, baby. She said you're the best part of all of us." That night, after Jacob fell asleep surrounded by his usual crowd of stuffed animals and science kits, Emily sat at the kitchen table and read the letter. It was handwritten in neat, slanted script. "My dearest Emily, by the time you read this, I imagine the board meeting is over and the truth is beginning to ripple through the company. I hope they saw what I've always seen, the brilliance in you, the fire in your son, and the quiet strength that no empire could ever erase. On the drive, you'll find everything. Proof that Richard didn't just abandon love, he abandoned ethics. The forged merger documents, the backdated marriage license, the manipulated stock transfers. I kept them all, not for revenge, but for Jacob, because he will need protection in the years ahead from the legacy his father left behind. Love him enough for both of us, and when the time is right, show him who you are and who he is." With everything I have left, Emily's fingers trembled as she plugged in the USB drive. The files were meticulously labeled, complete with timestamps, legal notations, and internal memos that painted a damning picture of the rise of Whitestone Global. Richard's betrayal hadn't just been personal, it had been strategic, cold, and criminal. Her phone buzzed. "Sandra, you need to hear this," she said. "Celeste's legal team just sent over a proposal for joint board control. They want to finalize it before the press catches wind of the merger's illegitimacy." Emily closed her laptop. "We'll talk in the morning." The next few weeks passed in a controlled storm of legal filings, investor calls, and silent strategy. Celeste played her part well, polished, ruthless, efficient. But it was Emily's quiet authority, backed by documents and decades of surgical precision, that turned the tide. Meanwhile, Jacob, unaware of the boardroom battles being waged around his future, thrived. He was reading college-level texts by age 4, conducting mock surgeries on his teddy bears, and dazzling every specialist who observed him with vocabulary and emotional intelligence far beyond his years. But Emily knew that brilliance came with weight, and she refused to let him carry it alone. She began setting aside time every evening, not for lessons but for stories. Stories of resilience, of failure, of healing. She told him about patients who beat the odds, about children who came into the world broken but left whole. And slowly she wove in pieces of their story, not to burden him, but to prepare him. One evening, as Jacob traced the outline of a diagram in her medical journal, he looked up and asked, "Is Daddy real?" Emily didn't flinch. She reached across the table and gently placed her hand over his. "Yes, he is, but he's not a part of our lives." Jacob thought for a moment. "Did he love me?" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I think he didn't know how, but that doesn't mean you're not lovable. You are, Jacob. You are everything." He nodded. That was enough for now. It wasn't long before news outlets began picking up the whispers. A front-page headline appeared in the Seattle Journal. Former CEO Richard Langley under investigation for corporate misconduct. Another followed days later. Innovation Wing at Children's Hospital, renamed in honor of Eleanor Langley, funded by Trust, established for prodigy son of leading surgeon. Emily sat quietly in her office when she saw the article, the printed page folded neatly beside a stack of surgical charts. She didn't react. She simply picked up her pen and continued reviewing her cases. She didn't need recognition. She needed results. And then one morning, Sandra burst through the lounge doors holding her tablet like it was on fire. "You need to see this." It was an email from Celeste's attorneys, an urgent request to schedule a private meeting to discuss Emily's now majority holding in Whitestone Global. Emily arched a brow. "That's not possible. I only own 15%, Sandra said. "Yes, but Eleanor transferred the rest to Jacob before her final treatment began." Emily stared at her, stunned. "It's all legal?" Carlos had confirmed it, ironclad, irrevocable. Together, Emily and Jacob now held 18%, making them the single largest stakeholder in the company. Celeste had underestimated Eleanor, so had Richard. But Emily? She had learned never to underestimate quiet love disguised as legacy. That evening, after a quiet dinner of pasta and carrot sticks, Jacob climbed into her lap, holding a drawing. It was a rough sketch of a heart, but with small tubes and flaps he had carefully labeled. "What's this?" she asked, smiling. "My own valve," he said proudly. "It's smaller and stronger." Emily kissed the top of his head. "Maybe we'll try building it one day. Can we start tomorrow?" "Maybe." He nodded seriously. "Okay, but first I have to finish my puzzle." She laughed, watching him dart off into the living room, and for a moment the world stopped moving. This was the legacy Eleanor had spoken of. Not boardrooms, not stock options, but a child with wonder in his eyes and the courage to imagine a better world. As she watched him flip through his books and begin fitting puzzle pieces together, Emily whispered under her breath, "We're almost there." And she meant it, not just in the war for justice, not just in the healing of wounds once carved so deep, but in the quiet knowing that love, steady, fierce, and deliberate, had built something no man could ever take apart. The morning sun poured through the east-facing windows of the Henderson Pediatric Innovation Wing, casting soft golden light across the tiled floors and fresh white walls. A small crowd had gathered outside the glass doors, murmuring with a mixture of anticipation and reverence. In the center of the hallway stood a tall, gleaming plaque, draped in a deep blue velvet cloth. Emily stood just beside it, her hands folded, her heart steady. She wore her white coat today, not a designer dress, not a sleek black suit, but the uniform that had never failed her. It was the one thing that reminded her always of who she truly was. Beside her, 9-year-old Jacob adjusted the collar of his tiny lab coat. It fit him better than it had a year ago, but the tag still had to be folded so it wouldn't itch. His hair was neatly combed, his hands tucked calmly in his pockets, though his eyes sparkled with energy. "You sure you're ready?" Emily asked gently, crouching beside him. Jacob nodded, beaming. "I was born ready. Remember, I wrote the speech myself." Across the room, a quiet hush fell over the gathered doctors, journalists, and hospital administrators as Sandra stepped forward to introduce the ceremony. "Today," she began, "we celebrate not just a milestone in pediatric medicine, but a legacy of compassion, determination, and brilliance. It is my honor to unveil the new name of this facility, the Margaret Whitestone Center for Pediatric Innovation." There was a collective intake of breath as the velvet was lifted, revealing a silver plaque etched with Margaret's name, and just beneath it, in smaller letters, "In recognition of Dr. Leo Jacob Dawson, youngest certified pediatric medical researcher in U.S. history." A burst of applause filled the corridor. Emily felt a tightness in her throat. She placed a hand over her heart as Jacob stepped forward to speak. His voice, clear and confident, echoed through the quiet hallway. "My grandmother, Margaret Whitestone, believed in building something that lasts. Not just buildings, not just companies, but people. She believed that knowledge and kindness should always go together, and she gave me the chance to prove it." He smiled up at Emily. "My mom taught me to listen to the smallest hearts, so I designed something small that could help fix them." There were murmurs of admiration, nods from seasoned surgeons. Behind the crowd, someone in a gray suit stepped quietly through the door and stood near the back. No one acknowledged him, but Emily felt his presence the moment he entered. Richard. He looked different now, older, thinner, stripped of the gleaming polish that once defined him. His face was etched with time, and his eyes carried the heavy weight of regret. But he didn't step forward. He just watched. Jacob continued, launching into a technical explanation of his heart valve design. First sketched when he was 7, now refined and ready for initial trials. He used words most adults wouldn't dare attempt, but there was no arrogance in his tone, just clarity. Purpose. When he finished, the applause was louder, more insistent. Emily stepped forward to place a hand on his shoulder. "I'm not sure I can follow that," she said with a soft laugh. "But I'll try." She turned to face the crowd. "Years ago, when my son was just a flutter inside me, I stood in an operating room, fighting for another child's life. I didn't know then how deeply my own would change. I didn't know I'd be raising a child who would someday teach me more than any textbook ever could." Her eyes found Richard's for the briefest moment. He looked down. "I used to believe my job was to repair hearts," Emily continued, "but Jacob showed me it's also about protecting them. And sometimes, The most fragile hearts, the smallest ones, carry the greatest strength. As the ceremony ended and the crowd dispersed, Jacob wandered toward the researcher's lounge with a small group of young interns in tow. They listened with awe as he explained the fluid dynamics model behind his valve prototype. Sandra appeared beside Emily, sipping from a paper cup. "You saw him, right?" she said without turning her head. "I felt him," Emily replied. "He didn't say a word." Maybe that's for the best. But later that afternoon, as the halls quieted and the staff returned to their rounds, Emily found herself in the atrium lobby, watching Jacob run his fingers across a glass display of historic surgical tools. She leaned against the railing, her eyes falling briefly on the man standing near the donor wall, alone, still, his hand pressed against the engraved name of Margaret Whitestone. Richard. She didn't approach him. She didn't need to. When he turned and their eyes met, there was no heat, no words exchanged, just a flicker of understanding. He nodded, slowly, sadly, then turned and walked away. In the days that followed, Emily resumed her work, her research now a global gold standard. Her inbox overflowed with invitations to speak, to lead, to collaborate. But she remained grounded in the work, anchored by the presence of her son, who spent most evenings curled beside her reading textbooks that most medical students feared. One evening, as they sat beneath the oak tree outside the hospital garden, Jacob rested his head in her lap with a book on bioengineering balanced on his chest. "Mom," he said quietly, "do you think I'll ever be as good as you?" Emily smiled and brushed a strand of hair from his forehead. "No," she whispered. "I think you'll be even better." He grinned, his eyes glowing in the fading light. "Then I better keep practicing." And he would. Across the world, Richard resurfaced only once more, briefly mentioned in a magazine article about former CEOs volunteering in underfunded children's hospitals across Southeast Asia. Emily saw the clipping, folded neatly on her desk one morning. She didn't read it. She didn't need to. Some wounds didn't need reopening. Instead, she walked into the pediatric wing, where a child with a failing heart awaited her. Jacob followed beside her, a small clipboard in hand. The world hadn't stopped. Hearts still needed mending. And so, side by side, mother and son walked forward. Not into vengeance, not into bitterness, but into the quiet rhythm of healing, where love had the final word. Thank you so much for staying with us until the end of this powerful story. If you're still here, it means the journey of Emily and Jacob touched something deep inside you, just as it did for us. This wasn't just a tale about betrayal, corporate power, or scientific breakthroughs. It was about love, the kind that doesn't shout, doesn't chase revenge, but builds quietly, patiently, and with unwavering strength. It reminds us that sometimes the greatest victories come not from fighting back with anger, but from choosing grace, purpose, and resilience. So let us ask you, where are you watching from today? We'd love to know where our community of listeners is joining us from around the world. And if this story moved you in any way, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel and click the bell icon so you won't miss our next heartwarming, dramatic, and unforgettable story. Because here, we believe in stories that heal, inspire, and stay with you long after they end. Until next time, stay kind, stay brave, and never stop believing in the strength of the human heart.